Appendix, Part 3, of A Narrative of the Life of Mrs. Mary Jemison. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Narrative of the Life of Mrs. Mary Jemison, by James E. Seaver. Appendix, Part 3. Anecdotes. Hoiketu used to say that when he was a young man, there lived in the same tribe with him an old Indian warrior, who was a great counselor, by the name of Buckinjehillish. Buckinjehillish having, with great fatigue, attended the council when it was deliberating upon war, declared that none but the ignorant made war, but that the wise men and the warriors had to do the fighting. This speech exasperated his countrymen to such a degree that he was apprehended and tried for being a witch, on the account of his having lived to so advanced an age, and because he could not show some reason why he had not died before, he was sentenced to be tomahawked by a boy on the spot, which was accordingly done. In the last war, 1814, an Indian who had been on fatigue, called at a commissary's and begged some bread. He was sent for a pail of water before he received it, and while he was absent, an officer told the commissary to put a piece of money into the bread, and observe the event. He did so. The Indian took the bread and went off, but on the next day, having ate his bread and found the money, he came to the commissary and gave him the same, as the officer had anticipated. Little Beard, a celebrated Indian chief, having arrived to a very advanced age, died at his town on the Genesee River about the 1st of June, 1806, and was buried after the manner of burying chiefs. In his lifetime he had been quite arbitrary, and had made some enemies whom he hated probably, and was not loved by them. The grave, however, deprives envy of its malignity and revenge of its keenness. Little Beard had been dead but a few days when the great eclipse of the sun took place on the 16th of June, which excited in the Indians a great degree of astonishment, for as they were ignorant of astronomy, they were totally unqualified to account for so extraordinary a phenomenon. The crisis was alarming, and something effectual must be done, without delay, to remove, if possible, the cause of such coldness and darkness, which it was expected would increase. They accordingly ran together in the 3 towns near the Genesee River, and after a short consultation, agreed that Little Beard, on the account of some old grudge which he yet cherished towards them, had placed himself between them and the sun, in order that their corn might not grow, and so reduce them to a state of starvation. Having thus found the cause, the next thing was to remove it, which could only be done the use of powder and ball. Upon this every gun and rifle was loaded, and a firing commenced, that continued without cessation till the old fellow left his seat, and the obscurity was entirely removed, to the great joy of the ingenious and fortunate Indians. In the month of February, 1824, Cornplanter, a learned pagan chief at Tonawanta, died of common sickness. He had received a liberal education, and was held in high estimation in his town and tribe by both parties. But the pagans more particularly mourned his loss deeply, and seemed entirely unreconciled. They imputed his death to witchcraft, and charged an Indian by the name of Prompit with the crime. Mr. Prompit is a Christian Indian, of the Tuscarora nation, who has lived at Tonawanta a number of years, where he has built a sawmill himself, which he owns, and is considered a decent, respectable man. About 2 weeks after the death of Cornplanter, Mr. Prompit happened in company where the author was present, and immediately begun to converse upon that subject. He said that the old-fashioned Indians called him a witch, believed that he had killed Cornplanter, and had said that they would kill him. But, said he, all good people know that I am not a witch, and that I am clear of the charge. Likely enough they will kill me, but if they do, my hands are clean, my conscience is clear, and I shall go up to God. I will not run nor hide from them, and they may kill me if they choose to. I am innocent. When Jesus Christ's enemies, said he, wanted to kill him, he did not run away from them, but let them kill him. And why should I run away from my enemies? How the affair will terminate, we are unable to decide. Description of Genesee River and its banks, from Mount Morris to the Upper Falls. From Mount Morris the banks of the Genesee are from 200 to 400 feet in height, with narrow flats on one side of the river or the other, till you arrive at the track called Gardow or Cross Hills. Here you come to Mrs. Jemison's Flats, which are 2 miles and a quarter long, and from 80 to 120 yards wide, lying mostly on the west side of the river. Near the upper end of these flats is the Great Slide. Directly above this, the banks, still retaining their before mentioned height, approach so near each other as to admit but 30 acres of flat on one side of the river only, and above this the perpendicular rock comes down to the water. From Gardow you ascend the river 5 miles to the lower falls, which are 93 feet perpendicular. These falls are 20 rods wide, and have the greatest channel on the east side. From Wolf Creek to these falls the banks are covered with elegant white and Norway pine. Above the lower falls the banks for about 2 miles are of perpendicular rock, and retain their height of between 200 and 400 feet. Having travelled this distance you reach the middle falls, which are an uninterrupted sheet of water 15 rods wide, and 110 feet in perpendicular height. This natural curiosity is not exceeded by anything of the kind in the western country, except the cataract at Niagara. From the middle falls the banks gradually rise till you ascend the river half a mile, when you come to the upper falls, which are somewhat rolling, 66 feet, in the shape of a harrow. Above this the banks are of moderate height. The timber from the lower to the upper falls is principally pine. Just above the middle falls a sawmill was erected this season, 1823, by Messrs. Seaver and Alva Palmer. Hunting anecdote. In November, 1822, Captain Stephen Rolfe and Mr. Alva Palmer drove a deer into Genesee River a short distance above the middle falls, where the banks were so steep and the current so impetuous that it could not regain the shore, and consequently was precipitated over the falls, 110 feet, into the gulf below. The hunters ran along the bank below the falls to watch the fate of the animal, expecting it would be dashed in pieces. But to their great astonishment it came up alive, and by swimming across a small eddy, reached the bank almost under the falls, and as it stood in that situation, Captain Ralph, who was at the top of the bank, shot it. This being done, the next thing to be considered was, how to get their prize. The rock being perpendicular, upwards of 100 feet, would not admit of their climbing down to it, and there was no way, apparently, for them to get at it, short of going down the river 2 miles, to the lower falls, and then by creeping between the water and the precipice they might possibly reach their game. This process would be too tedious. At length Mr. Palmer proposed to Captain Rolfe and Mr. Heman Merwin, who had joined them, that if they would make a windlass and fasten it to a couple of saplings that stood near, and then procure some ropes, he would be let down and get the deer. The apparatus was prepared, the rope was tied round Palmer's body, and he was let down. On arriving at the bottom he unloosed himself, fastened the rope round the deer, which they drew up, and then threw down the rope, in which he fastened himself, and was drawn up without having sustained any injury. From the top to the bottom of the rock, where he was let down, was exactly 120 feet. Finesse. End of Appendix, Part 3. End of A Narrative of the Life of Mrs. Mary Jemison, by James E. Seaver.